Good Saturday morning, everybody. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to the Hurricane Hub off-season edition for May 13th, 2023. And you can tell by the title, it's almost time. We are basically at mid-May now, and from here on out, the hurricane season in the Eastern Pacific is about to start very soon, and I'll actually touch upon some stuff relating to time a little bit later on, but the East Pacific season is about to start, and usually when we get to that time period, at least me, I like to know and like to think that that's more or less of a marking that the Atlantic season is about to start, and indeed it is. Take a look at the amount of days till June 1st. We're at 19 days, less than a month, and basically um, almost nearing half a month left till the hurricane season has started. So, of course, now is the time to really start to prepare. So, once again, it is so when the storm is actually coming, you have everything prepared, and it's not too late to prepare because the storm is on your way. But that's just always good to prepare in advance. But hey, very interesting news out of NOAA and the National Hurricane Center. Taking a look at the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season homepage. Yes, the season hasn't officially started yet, but I don't know if a lot of you remember, but you remember this invest that we had in the Atlantic 90L that occurred somewhere in mid-January. I don't think I was really tracking it that much, but the NOAA has decided to come out and say that indeed we did have already one system occur so far in the Atlantic. We had an unnamed subtropical storm that occurred in mid-January, if you remember. When it did occur, it was this invest that occurred, 90L, I believe. And there was a lot of debate around the time because it did look like a pretty good system to be named, but the National Hurricane Center didn't name it. And by the way, if you want official proof, here's the NHC. This is from directly from the NHC homepage. This is kind of their public information statement, as they say on the top over here. But generally, just them officially saying that there was indeed a storm. There will be a reassessment of the storm. I believe they'll give official information sometime soon, but they did say they did reassess it and did realize it was a subtropical storm. And they once again did say in a tropical cyclone report they will release during the next couple of months when we'll get more information. Not that it means anything, because of course it was January that this did occur in, and if I'll be honest with you, it's probably much more likely to be closer towards the 2022 season because we were just at the beginning of the year than we were in 2023. And of course, where did this occur? This was in the subtropics. Hence, you can take a look at the track that they give over here. Not really official yet, but we'll probably get actual official data on the track once it comes out. But this is like preliminary reanalysis, I guess. That's the best way to put it. This did occur in the subtropics. It formed from non-tropical origins, and of course it was deemed a subtropical storm. So anybody that is more or less wondering whether or not this is the telltale sign of the season, it's not. It's more or less some sort of out of season storm that we can have from time to time. That does occur. If you remember Arlene back in 2017, that was a April out of season, very early season subtropical system that occurred. And heck, you could even take a look at the last few years when we had off season storms. Except last year, every single year there was a storm in May or April, of course, including 2017. Um, and yeah, most of the times there were active years, but it really is sometimes not really an indicator for activity. And it really does go to show that storms, when conditions are right, can really form at any time of the year. It just really depends on whether or not conditions are favorable. Hence why we have a hurricane season, because usually that's when conditions are most favorable. But that does not exclude. I would say that does not exclude storms forming from any time of the year. Hence, what we see right now with the subtropical system that formed in January. It's not getting the name Arlene because, of course, it was not tracked in real time as an operational. Operationally, it was not tracked in real time, so this is not getting the name Arlene. But at least when it comes to naming with tropical depressions. If we were to get another storm, the first official operational storm, it would be named Tropical Depression 2 instead of 1 because we already had one. Interesting to note, but moving on to present day, of course, this is actually something that's occurring in the Indian Ocean right now. And this is a live storm. This is Tropical Cyclone Mocha. Interesting name to give it, but of course, this is not a storm to be, messed around with at all because Tropical Cyclone Mocha in the Indian Ocean, just like we have hurricanes in the Atlantic, they are the same phenomenon that's going on in the tropical cyclone. This is impacting and threatening Myanmar and Burma in the Indian Ocean, and just like we would have with Atlantic storms, life-threatening storm surge, heavy rainfall, making its way towards that area right now. And we could actually go to CIMS. I really love this website, by the way. It's from the University of Wisconsin. Has information on global storms basically across everywhere, and you can see it right now. It's a Category 4 strength system with winds of 130 knots as of the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, which covers this part of the world, and it is about to make landfall. And I believe Myanmar probably is a Category 4 system, and 130 knots, if you're not familiar with of the relationship between knots and miles an hour, that is 150 miles an hour wind speed, and this is going to be a very strong storm headed towards that area. And not much I could say. Probably very heavy rainfall, storm surge. If anybody's along the coast watching there, evacuate with the time that you still have. Same sort of situation that we have when we have strong landfalling systems in the Atlantic. This is no different, and it'll definitely be a devastating storm for whoever it's about to hit. Just wanted to bring that up really quickly because, of course, the Atlantic is not the only place that we see tropical systems in the whole globe. There's always tropical cyclones happening somewhere in the world. Well, not always, like every single day, but you get what I mean. There's always at least somewhere that this activity is trying to spin up, and we do have activity, and pretty significant activity right now occurring somewhere, so worth mentioning than not, especially since there's nothing going on in the Atlantic right now. But still, we could always pull up a visible satellite image of the Atlantic to see what's popping, I guess. Nothing much, of course, as obvious. It's May, it's mid-May. Hurricane season has not started yet, and of course you could still see something that, if I always mention throughout the off season, that we have strong vertical wind shear in the upper levels, which hence is why we usually have hurricane season between June and November, because right now in May there's a lot of wind shear. You could also really look at it by looking at the clouds. You see them going west to east in a very fast fashion in the upper levels. That is not favorable for tropical system development at all right now. And you could also see these low-level clouds out here, which is indicative of Saharan air and, of course, dry air that we usually see early on in the season. So, of course, really not much favorable right now. But, of course, within the next few weeks, it'll change. And by the way, on Saharan air, I'll actually bring us up something very interesting that we'll use throughout the season later on. I'll mention something about Saharan air, so stay tuned for that. But of course, moving on to our sea surface temperature anomalies, as we always do every single week. And boy, does the bloody warm Atlantic continue. Really warm out there right now. Take a look at these anomalies off Africa, reaching the 3 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees. Even some reds you could see, dark reds, like off the scale you could see there. And in general, the Atlantic is very warm, and you combine that with this look in the northwest Atlantic off the Canadian Maritimes against that. Really, I'm not kidding when I'll tell you that in an active season, in any normal year without developing El Nino that we have right now, this would be the recipe for a historical season. Really, the way the Atlantic is really warm right now, really something to write home about. It's really very interesting and almost mind-blowing we have an Atlantic this warm, because we don't really see it that often this warm. I'm really talking about this is in the top percent of warm Atlantics that we have, but it's just, almost in a way kind of like, I wouldn't say wasted, but since we have a developing El Nino, there will be some sort of suppressed effects unless the Atlantic is able to hold its ground, which I did talk about in my forecast. If you've not seen that, I recommend you to do so. But maybe we'll have to see. Of course, this season we have not had once again a situation that we have this year with a combination of a developing El Nino, a developing warm ENSO event, and an Atlantic this warm. Really not something we've had really ever, at least in the last couple of years, especially with El Ninos dating back to most recent years. We've not really had a case like this, so anything could really happen, and indeed, we'll see if anything does happen that is interesting. But of course, as I did mention, we're still in a developing El Nino, and once again, the Nino 3.4 did actually indeed reach El Nino strength. We're now at the latest value of almost 6 degrees Celsius above normal, and the El Nino threshold is 0.5 degrees Celsius above normal. So we are definitely heading towards an El Nino. And once again, just mentioning the Atlantic MDR. This is, of course, the NOAA Coral Reef Watch analysis. Very warm Atlantic. Our peak was at 0.8 degrees Celsius roughly a few weeks ago in late April, when we had that really strong westerly wind event with the very strong negative North Atlantic oscillation event that we had several weeks ago. Has cooled down a little bit since, because we've had an increase in trades, but we're still at 0.65 degrees Celsius above normal. That's still quite warm, especially given how much of area of water that we're talking about, because 0.6 degrees Celsius in a small container, let's say, is maybe not that much warm above normal, but over a vast ocean of thousands of miles across and hundreds of meters deep that this warm water extends, that's a lot of energy to take into consideration. So this being very warm is definitely something to really watch, and we'll monitor how this really progresses throughout the season, because boy, will I tell you, it is interesting when we have a very warm Atlantic that we have here against a very warm ENSO that we'll probably have developing out here. It's definitely going to be a very interesting dynamic to watch as we go throughout the season. But of course, once again, to reiterate, El Nino is developing. For those that are not really aware of yet, the SOI 30-day average is at -5, so really been tanking over the last few weeks, and the SOI, the 90-day value, has finally reached the negative territory. It's at 0.79 points below normal, and it will probably continue to go below normal as the SOI continues to tank, unless of course it does maybe have a spike back to neutral in the next few weeks. We'll have to see if that does happen. But of course, the atmosphere is definitely in slow transition. We're not entirely there yet, which is actually something I've been seeing people talk about, how the atmosphere is still kind of taking a little bit of a lag with this El Nino development, and that'll also be something I'm very interested in to see how that plays into the dynamics of this season. But nevertheless, we are still headed towards an El Nino. The atmosphere is slowly transitioning into that, and of course the SOI values is one good way we could see that occurring. We are seeing a tank, at least right now in the short term. It is beginning to tank, and of course that does show conditions are slowly making their way towards El Nino. Even if it's slow, it's still happening. But anyway, just taking a look at the zonal wind anomalies for the next few weeks, and you can see how the SOI is kind of tanking. Very strong westerly winds in the Western Pacific, although I do find it interesting how the GFS is kind of showing. This is the GFS, by the way, if you can see right here. This is the forecast from this point to here. This is going out towards the end of May. Notice, interesting how we still do have some easterly winds in the Pacific, and as I did mention a couple of seconds ago about potential lag in the atmosphere, this is something that people are, talking about and taking into consideration when we're talking about a lag in the atmosphere potentially with this developing El Nino. We still have trades occurring in the Pacific, the Eastern Pacific. So that's still definitely something to note when it comes to the development of the El Nino, because of course it is coming, but especially in my opinion, what will really determine how the Atlantic is affected by this is how fast and how fast this comes in and how strong it gets as it comes in. Two really big important things we'll have to watch with this, and I'll definitely monitor. But very interesting to see these trades still in these zonal wind anomalies. Probably will have some sort of effect of slowing down development, or at least keeping the development of what's going on with this El Nino from going speed ahead straight towards strong El Nino for now. So that'll be interesting to watch. But still, very high confidence of this occurring. The CPC IRI just released their latest forecast, and I believe it does peak very high. You can see this is the 90% chance, and actually still kept the actual page where you can find this. This is the CPC. This is the Columbia Climate School International Research Institution, and this is from the CPC forecast. This is the official CPC ENSO probability. I mean, you know this by now. We always bring it up every single month, but anyway, what I'm trying to show you here, El Nino, and look at the percentage that they have by the time we get to August, September, October, and this is interesting because this is the peak of the season. They have a 93% chance of an El Nino occurring. Very high confidence that we could potentially be in a El Nino by then, and if you look even further, possibly even a decent strength El Nino by this time, and then we peak at 94% chance for an El Nino, especially by the time we get to the fall and winter months. So very high confidence that this El Nino is developing once again. Really gotta reiterate, what will really matter the most this season, especially in affecting the Atlantic and kind of offsetting the conditions there and potentially saving us from having a really active hurricane season, will be really based on how strong this El Nino gets and how fast it gets there, how fast it gets, how fast it develops, and how fast it gets strong. That's really the most important thing, because if we're still having a lagging atmosphere and we're still kind of seeing development slow, like we still kind of do right now, once again going back to the zonal wind anomalies, if we still have this, that will not really facilitate a fast developing El Nino, and therefore we could still see some potential effects of the Atlantic still trying to take over, and we'll potentially still see an active season either way. But it all just really depends, which is why we got to watch this really closely. But still kind of remarkable, 94% chance that we have confidence for an El Nino developing sometime. Really does go to show still that we will have an El Nino of some sorts. Once again, just really got to reiterate, how strong will it get? That's really the most important thing. But anyway, Ben Knowles showing, as of this week, he showed the European velocity potential anomalies, shows a coupled El Nino event beginning in June. Rising motion begins to develop in the Pacific. Major sinking cell over the eastern Indian Ocean continent, as of course Indian Ocean and maritime continent. Of course, something that is usually a hallmark of El Nino. We see, I mean, if you remember with La Nina, we usually see rising motion in the Indian Ocean and the maritime continent, and that's how we have a La Nina develop, because there's sinking air in the eastern Pacific. El Nino is obviously the opposite, so just think of how the pattern is with a La Nina and kind of flip it. And we have, instead of sinking air in the Pacific, we have rising air in the Pacific, which helps develop the El Nino. But he also mentions a competing rising cell over the eastern Pacific and Africa and the Atlantic, and the latter very important to the hurricane season. Indeed it is, because rising motion in the Atlantic, I guess you could kind of associate it, especially with potentially the warm MDR that we have coming into play, maybe helping facilitate some sort of rising cell in the Atlantic, which is what the European is showing. But this is very interesting indeed. Rising cell in the Atlantic maybe could help kind of offset El Nino conditions, as some people have been saying. And on top of that, Danny Moore is posting the precipitation across the Atlantic, because of this, is quite deep, and is quite wet. And this is actually piggybacking off a tweet that he brought up. This is from the UK Met seasonal, by the way. All of this, the precipitation and this ridge pattern, which he does mention, is more of a favorable look for the East Coast or out to sea recurvatures this season, more or less in line with how El Nino tends to play out in the Atlantic. Um, but he does mention as well as this the UK Met seasonal is out and continues to show moderate to strong El Nino, and of course a very strong positive AMO signature. And he does say, assuming it holds, will likely be the strongest since 2010, and even shows 2020, for instance. And look at that in the Atlantic. Look at the signature we have from 2020 to now. Quite incredible how much warmer we are than 2020, and it really does go to show the mixed bag of signals we're looking at in the Atlantic. And we can even take a look at precipitation forecasts from 2020, and look at it this year. Notice how much more precipitation is in the deep tropics. Very interesting. But of course, he does mention also interesting precipitation pattern in the Gulf of Mexico and the West Caribbean. And he does also mention the pattern is quite wet across the deep tropics and extends into the southwest Atlantic. So that is very interesting indeed. Whether or not that does mean potential tracks into the southwest Atlantic, because sometimes we do tend to look at these precipitation anomalies to see if there's, of course, indeed potentially a track correlation, or potentially they're trying to hint of maybe some sort of track that could occur in the season. We'll have to see, but I mean, it does kind of align pretty well when we have in consideration the very warm Atlantic that we have in place and a very wet deep tropics. It goes hand in hand. So something very interesting. We'll watch, of course, on top of the other interesting things we have to watch this season. But moving right along, as I did mention earlier about Saharan Air, Saharan Air is something that we have in place right now, and probably will continue to have in place over the next few months as we kind of ease our way into hurricane season. And that's very evident from this map, which is something that we'll bring up throughout the season a lot more, especially by the time we get to June and July, when we have these huge Saharan air outbreaks that move off the coast of Africa and for a while plague the MDR. And we're not really going to be able to get much because conditions are not yet favorable, but by the time we get to August, this kind of lifts up and we see things really begin to light up across the MDR. Probably a little less this year because of El Nino, but still it will happen eventually. But this is a map also from the University of Wisconsin CIMS website. Again, really goes to show how much I love that website, and you should really use it too. It has a lot of useful tools there, especially for real-time tracking throughout the season. Some really good tools for real-time tracking. One of them, the Saharan Air Map. We'll use this throughout the season, of course, as it is approaching very soon. And this is a useful tool to monitor Saharan air, especially for and potentially tracking any developing system that does occur throughout the season. It'll be a useful tool to use for that. Moving on, though, really quickly, since it is May and it's still severe weather season, why not take a look at severe weather that we have right now? Slight risk and effect for portions of the Midwest. That's Iowa, I believe that's there. Tornado risk, 5%. And then we have a wind and a hail risk at 15%. Nothing significant for today, though. So that's always good. Day 2, marginal risk for portions of Tennessee, Kentucky, and I believe that's Illinois and Indiana. So potentially something to watch there. And then a small marginal risk for the southeast come Monday. But of course nothing of significance on the horizon. It is May, we're still in severe weather season, but of course very soon it'll be June and we'll start to see Bermuda High set up, and we'll start to see a lot of humidity across the southeast, and the jet stream lifts north, and any big severe weather event will probably begin to occur. Any window for big severe weather events will probably be further north than we're seeing right now, as the summer pattern begins to set in and we see a lot less in the way of severe weather from fronts and big troughs that move across the United States, and more or less maybe afternoon thunderstorms from humid weather that we see when the summer pattern begins to set in. And just why not take a look at the next few days extending past day 3, and of course nothing else on the horizon, because not a lot of potential that is there right now. We are slowly beginning to ease away from severe weather season. And of course, by the date May 13th, we are slowly beginning to ease into hurricane season. So, of course, our transition from winter to spring is, of course, almost done. And soon we'll see our transition, and it's probably already beginning to occur, our transition from spring to summer. And, of course, with that comes hurricane season and all this other stuff as well. And of course, speaking of hurricane season, as I did mention earlier, the East Pacific season is about to start very soon on Monday. And henceforth, because of that, is henceforth the right word? I don't know, whatever. And because of that, that's the bottom line that I'm trying to say. This will be indeed our last off-season edition discussion for the Hurricane Hub. Yes, indeed it is. It's that time of year now. Off-season edition will be dropped starting Monday, and as well as that, we will, of course, start posting, or at least I'll try to start posting daily videos all the way to November 30th, because that's the end of hurricane season. And I guess it's also good to start doing that as well, since not only does the Eastern Pacific season start, but the National Hurricane Center begins to release discussions, tropical weather bulletins for the Atlantic on May 15th now. They are, of course, starting it from June 1st. June 1st is still the official start of the season, but at least for tracking, especially because over the last few years we've had so much May activity, they found that it was, of course, more fitting to start doing discussions for the Atlantic on May 15th. So we'll start doing those Monday, and we'll drop the off season. And that just really shows that we're really getting close to time for the hurricane season. It's really about to be upon us, and yeah, that's really all there is to say. Hurricane season is coming. Really gotta reiterate that, I guess. And yeah, we'll begin daily discussions starting May 15th, and we'll see how the season plays out, I guess, because we've been tracking the off-season conditions. We've been tracking El Nino and La Nina for a while, and now it's all boiled down to this, really. Now all there is to do is just to see what exactly happens. How does everything play out with all the factors that are in place? And that's indeed what we'll be doing starting Monday. And really excited to see where this takes us, where the journey goes from here out until the end of hurricane season. What indeed we'll have to see, but definitely interesting. We'll definitely be here to track it. But other than that, that is it for this discussion. Thanks for watching, of course. Stay safe, and if you did like what you saw today, please subscribe, like, share with family and friends, as I always like to say, of course, so we have a community, which is always important, to have a community to track and to always notify each other when, of course, there's something that does occur, especially since we're once again getting very close to the season starting, and it is just about upon us. But anyways, that is it for today. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you here starting every day, starting on Monday. See ya.